It's my pleasure now to introduce a new speaker at one of our forums. Michael Dudley has a master in library information science and a master's in city planning, which will position him uniquely once the attribution is switched to Oxford, because Castle Hedingham and its little village will need some help from people like Michael to deal with the onrush of interest there. He is the Community Outreach Librarian at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba. He has previously delivered lectures on his research into the lived experience of becoming an Oxfordian, as well as a TED Talk, Liberating Shakespeare. His presentation today is based on his chapter, With Swinish Phrase Soiling Their Edition, Epistemic Injustice, Academic Freedom, and the Shakespeare Authorship Question, published under the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education in Teaching and Learning Practices for Academic Freedom, published last year. Michael's topic today is the Stratfordian belief system, epistemic injustice, and academic freedom. Please take it away, Michael.
Thank you very much, Earl, for that introduction. It's great to be able to follow on that presentation, Jim, because I'm hoping that my presentation can contribute to that strategy of overcoming academic resistance. My research agenda in the articles I've published in Brief Chronicles and the Oxfordian aren't really so much about new evidence for Oxford or evidence against Shakespeare, but it's all about applying external, disinterested, theoretical and pedagogical frameworks to Stratfordian scholarship to just show the extent to which mainstream Shakespeare scholarship does not meet the standards that are otherwise recognized in the academy as what sound scholarship ought to be. So I'm just going to share my slides here. So I'm talking about the Stratfordian belief system. That's my starting point. And so we're not dealing just with an authorial attribution, but this is actually a multi-layered belief system. And the question I'm asking is, how is that belief system defended, and how can we, overcome that resistance, as Jim put it? So I've got two sets of external criteria that I'm using to examine this belief system, and that is virtue epistemology, which I'll be explaining in a minute. And as Earl mentioned, there's the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, which was officially adopted by the Association of College and Research Libraries in 2016. So this is a pedagogical tool that we academic librarians use to teach library instruction to undergraduate students and to try to inculcate in them what, a disposition towards sound scholarship. I'm going to be looking at key Stratfordian rhetoric and scholarly practices through this framework and through this lens of virtue epistemology. As Earl mentioned, this was a chapter published in a book this past November, Teaching and Learning Practices for Academic Freedom, edited by Anakshi Sengupta and Patrick Blessinger. And I think just in terms of overcoming academic resistance, this is a mainstream academic press, Emerald Publishing. This is part of a long-standing series. This is volume 34 in their series, and they didn't bat an eyelid about publishing a chapter about the authorship question. So, we are making progress in the academy. So what do I mean by Stratfordianism as a belief system? So I say I'm a Stratfordian, and I believe Shakespeare is Shakespeare. That's my propositional belief. William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was the author, William Shakespeare. And of course, I don't even make a distinction between those spellings. But I also have a second order belief about that belief, that it is a certainty, beyond questioning, beyond doubt. And if you do have any questions, if you are going to challenge me on that belief, I have a host of explanatory beliefs, that Kevin mentioned some of these, the lost years, the miracle of genius, the key documentary evidence is now lost. But these beliefs are faith-based. They are completely unfalsifiable. You cannot disprove any of these. So it's very difficult to challenge. But because I have these beliefs, I also have a reflexive belief about myself as a believer that I cannot be questioned, that I am authoritative in my belief about Shakespeare. I also have an ethical belief that you are not only factually incorrect if you question me, if you question if Shakespeare was Shakespeare, but you are actually immoral. And so I therefore have a juridical or justice-based belief that you need to be punished, that you need to be isolated, excluded, and marginalized within the academy. So what I'm saying is that it's not just this historical fact about the authorship of Shakespeare that we are needing to deal with in terms of human cognitive and institutional resistance, as Jim put it, but it is a belief system, and each one of these elements is all mutually reinforcing. It's what makes it so difficult for Stratfordians to face the evidence honestly and for them to actually bother reading the work that we produce. So how then to challenge this belief system? I'm using a theory called virtue epistemology. So epistemology is the theory and study of knowledge, how we know what we think we know. And virtue epistemology, says that knowledge just isn't out there. It's actually situated within people, within communities, within groups of people. And so it's looking at, first of all, learning opportunities within our environments, that we have to, that there's an unequal access to knowledge. We can't learn knowledge that may not be available to us. If a virtue epistemologist was to look at the traditional biography of Shakespeare, they would certainly say that that was completely ridiculous. But we're also looking at epistemic character and conduct. Are we open-minded? Are we closed-minded? Do we ignore evidence that's inconvenient to us? Virtue epistemology then is also this ethical framework for looking at our relationships with other knowers and our obligations towards them, to listen to them, to engage in conversation. And so individually and then collectively, as a group, as a community of knowers, we create epistemic systems. Shakespeare biography is an example of an epistemic system. And virtue epistemology can help us understand the nature and resilience of these systems and their ability to allow us to ask new questions, to generate new knowledge. There's a lot to the theories of virtue epistemology. I'm going to focus on three. One is epistemic vice, which is committed by knowers acting in bad faith. So this is poor epistemic conduct, ignoring, disregarding inconvenient evidence, or having poor epistemic character, being dogmatic, being arrogant, refusing to listen to other people. And that is then part of perpetrating testimonial injustice on other people. So you're prejudicially refusing to listen to them based on the class of knowers to which they belong. And then that group of people suffers epistemic oppression, that they are persistently excluded from participating in fields of knowledge production. So I'm sure this is all sounding very familiar to you. There's a particular form of epistemic vice that post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians have to contend with, and that is accusations of conspiracy theory, which calls into question the speaker's character, mischaracterizes their claims, compares them invidiously to absurd claims or highly offensive ones. And we're all familiar with the accusations that this is like Holocaust denial. But what it means is that it confines the inquiry to asking why people believe these crazy ideas rather than addressing the substance of their claims. Now, I know at this particular historical and political juncture that there are conspiracy theories that are baseless, that are harmful and toxic to the body politic, but we have to keep in mind that not all conspiracy theories are created equally. And actually, that is something that Stratfordians will say, is that all conspiracy theories are the same, but they're not. To say that they are, to have this blanket accusation, of conspiracy theory for ideas you find inconvenient is a preemption of the investigative process, and it is a mechanism of exclusion. So in this chapter then, the tool that I use, this external framework, to analyze Stratfordian rhetoric and scholarly practices is the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, which was adopted in 2016 by the Association of College and Research Libraries. The ACRL is the largest and oldest division of the American Library Association. This is the major academic library association with members in the US and Canada. And this framework is widely adopted. I teach this framework myself as part of library instruction to try to encourage students to think about what sound scholarship consists of. The framework has 6 elements. The first is that authority is constructed and contextual. That what constitutes expertise, conventional wisdom in a discipline may change over time. And the example that I use, and one that we often refer to in the authorship question, is Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift, which from when it was introduced in 1915 to most of the first half of the 20th century until it was finally adopted in the mid-1960s, when the mechanism of tectonic plates was able to explain it. But it just shows that mainstream scholarship can exclude ideas that end up becoming the new mainstream. Closely related to this is the idea that information has value, that structures and systems of value in the academy, in the publishing industry, in academic libraries, public libraries, will give precedence to mainstream ideas, mainstream knowledge, and tend to reproduce those mainstream ideas and kind of marginalize new and unknown ideas. And so there's that disparity that grants precedence to authorities. But as the first frame tells us, these things can change over time. The third frame is research as inquiry. So when we have gaps in our knowledge, it's a cue that we need to be asking different, better, and deeper questions, and not to gloss over these gaps in our knowledge. So this is the core epistemological element of this framework. The fourth is that information creation is a process. This gets at formats for information, and depending on the nature and the purpose, the audience for a piece of knowledge production, it may be a scholarly article, it could be a chapter, it could be a documentary film. I'm looking at you, Cheryl. It could be a podcast, it could be a website. But the point is that we do not make assumptions about the underlying process behind different formats and just dismiss that format because it's not a peer-reviewed scholarly article. Closely related to that is the fifth frame, searching as strategic exploration, that we don't confine ourselves to a small pool of sources or even to the journals within a particular discipline, but we look widely. We look at what other disciplines, what other perspectives they can give on our topic. We maybe look for professional associations, institutions, and find out, what they're producing. We think as widely as we can. And the sixth frame is scholarship as conversation. Peer-reviewed journals, conferences, they're all part of scholarly dialogue, events like this. So ethically, we do not arbitrarily exclude people from that conversation. So we see then these 6 elements. It's normative, it's aspirational, but it's also ethical. It gets at how we treat other knowers in our own search for knowledge. And I realized several years ago that I could use this framework as a lens for examining Stratfordian scholarship and rhetoric, and to see how well it actually constitutes the standards of this external criteria. So let's see what we can find. The first frame, authority is constructed and contextual. Paul Edmondson writes that the authorship question is, quote, a clash between the professional Shakespeare scholar and the anti-Shakespearean amateur. The former employs often highly specialized knowledge. The latter denies it. there is the loaded assumption that even though one may lack the necessary knowledge and expertise, it is always acceptable to challenge and contradict a knowledgeable and expert authority. It is not. This is just one of many examples that I have in my chapter, that there's this pattern of that Stratfordians are the experts in Shakespeare studies. Anyone who questions Shakespeare's authorship is by definition not a scholar and therefore may be excluded. So completely contradicting the spirit of frame 1. Frame 2, information has value. Stratfordian books tend to dominate the bestseller lists. Post-Stratfordian, Oxfordian literature is marginalized. And a great example of that is in 2013, Paul Edmondson and Stanley Wells produced Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, which is now owned in 326 libraries worldwide, whereas the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition produces Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, exposing an industry in denial. It's only in 33 libraries around the world. Now, Stratfordians will triumphantly just, take for granted that they have this mainstream acceptance because of the, truthfulness of their claims as opposed to the alleged absurdity of ours. But what this frame tells us is that what we're looking at is the instruments, the structures of value in the academy, in publishing industries, and in library collection development. But that even though these authorities are given precedence now, that may change over time. Frame 3, research as inquiry. Even though some Stratfordians admit that direct evidence linking Shakespeare to the works is scant or non-existent, and even Sir Stanley Wells admitted this in his chapter in Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, yet questioning the assumption of Shakespeare's authorship and following the evidence honestly is rejected, ridiculed, demonized, and in fact, pathologized. So Joseph Rosenblum writes in the Definitive Shakespeare Companion that no evidence for other candidates can exist. Edmondson and Wells again write that all alternative candidates are equally invalid, none has a greater claim, all the suggestions rest on equally false premises. Well, both of these statements are completely fallacious. You can't just have this universal godlike declaration that certain knowledge can never exist without actually having an inquiry and looking into it. But these statements are not opening, they're not a foundation for inquiry. They're putting the lid on it. They're shutting off the possibility of inquiry. Edmondson and Wells again, and trust me, they were a bottomless well of quotes for this chapter, really quite endless. They wrote that the authorship question is ultimately a dangerous phenomenon which can lead to conspiratorial narratives fueled by denials of historical evidence, as well as being an entirely parasitic phenomenon, attacking the truth in order to feed off of its lifeblood, attaching itself leech-like to a healthy body, because it is dangerous and immoral to question history. So not only are we cutting off inquiry, we are actually pathologizing having an open mind. Frame 4, information creation as a process. In 2014, the book Shakespeare and the Digital World was released, which explored Shakespeare on the web, videos, online courses, wikis, etc. But there was no reference made to any of the online production of post-Stratfordians or Oxfordians. No YouTube videos, no declaration of reasonable doubt, apart from a passing reference to conspiracy hubs. So they just made a blanket assumption about the underlying process, that it's all a conspiracy theory, and so all of that knowledge production could be ignored. Frame 5, searching as strategic exploration. Again, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, 2013, ignored 60 years worth of authorship scholarship. Rosenblum's chapter on the authorship question in the Definitive Shakespeare Companion had a paltry, I think, 5 citations, a couple from the 1950s, 1960s, only one book from an authorship question perspective from the 1990s. So exhibiting, as most Stratfordian scholarship does, a deliberate, willful, strategic decision to avoid actually reading the work that post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians produce, so that they can keep making their tired and frequently debunked statements. Finally, scholarship as conversation. That we experience gatekeeping in scholarly journals, and the example I give is Richard Wageman's 2014 paper that was submitted and accepted to the journal Memoria de Shakespeare, but when editor Gary Taylor comes on board, he pulls the article and compares the authorship question to Holocaust denial. The fact that we're totally excluded from mainstream Wikipedia Shakespeare articles, as Wageman has pointed out, that post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians may occasionally be accepted into mainstream peer-reviewed journals, but only if we self-censor our Oxfordianism. So what do we see then with these frames? Authority is constructed and contextual demonstrates that Stratfordians espouse and indeed demand an uncritical acceptance of their own authority. Information has value, reveals the extent to which current scholarly publishing practices lend unwarranted value to Stratfordian voices. Research as inquiry exposes Stratfordian scholarship as a closed circular system incapable of asking relevant questions about the biography of Shakespeare. Information creation as a process shows how these mechanisms of exclusion extend across all formats. Searching as strategic exploration demonstrates the willfully anemic, strategic, and deliberate anemic sourcing in leading Stratfordian publications. And scholarship as conversation depicts an academic community actively excluding post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians from the scholarly conversation. So according to the criteria established by the American Library Association through the ACRL, Stratfordian rhetoric and scholarly practices are inconsistent with this normative framework for sound scholarship. What can virtue epistemology theory tell us as well? That Stratfordians exhibit bad faith, poor epistemic conduct, and commit epistemic vice almost consistently when it comes to the authorship question and with addressing the claims of post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians. A particular epistemic vice that they use is the accusation of conspiracy theory as a mechanism of exclusion. And so as a result, we post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians suffer testimonial injustice. We are not believed, we are not listened to, we are not read. These rhetorics and practices perform what's called forum control in the discipline of Shakespeare studies, maintaining the epistemological system of Shakespeare biography. But what virtue epistemology theory tells us is that epistemic systems need to be robust, they need to be resilient. And what we see here is that the epistemic system of Shakespeare biography has a big hollow hole in the core of it that its practitioners are not addressing. And that the major way that they are buttressing this epistemic system is through acts of epistemic vice and perpetrating epistemic injustice and oppression. What we see here in this phenomenon, as we knew, of course, is that this is a significant but under-examined threat to academic freedom. And it limits the thinkable and the sayable for everyone who cares about Shakespeare, including Stratfordians themselves. And one of the ideas in virtue epistemology is that when you commit epistemic oppression, you are not just excluding people from knowledge production and forcing them to suffer, but you are actually oppressing yourself because you cannot know well if you are excluding other knowers. If you're not listening to them, if you're not reading them, your own knowledge production will be deficient. And so what we're seeing is, centuries of an impoverished and needlessly constrained discipline. The Shakespeare Professoriate needs to grant academic freedom equally to post-Stratfordians and to themselves. They're denying themselves academic freedom as part of maintaining these institutional barriers that Jim identified. But they need to, because the grace of Shakespeare is that there is always another side to things. There is always doubt. Now, if you want to read more about my theorizing about the Stratfordian belief system, I'm going to explore that more fully in my upcoming article in the Oxfordian called Stratfordian Epistemology and the Ethics of Belief, where I use yet another external theoretical framework, that of the ethics of belief, to look at Stratfordian beliefs. So, questions or comments?
John Hamill's asked, how do we break through this seemingly editing out and denial of any Oxfordian research? How do we promote change, in your opinion?
Well, I think pursuing through other disciplines is one route. Like, I think we can be going to rhetoric and communication. We go to conferences on the sociology of knowledge, contributing to journals of epistemology. I think being able to apply external theoretical frameworks to this phenomenon in a variety of disciplines can help expose what's been going on for so long, and that the English departments are holding themselves captive this way.
The Shelley Maycock makes a comment that the American Library Association violated their own mission statement in backing the Folger First Folio tour, which censored heavily and excluded analysis of their message. How do we bring pressures upon such organizations to expose their failures of consistency?
That is an interesting point. Although I will say that I actually published an online article through the journal American Libraries, which is the official organ, the magazine of the American Library Association, for the Folio Tour. And I was quite open about my Oxfordianism. And again, the editors had no problem at all accepting that. But yeah, I do think that would be a valid point to raise. Questioning institutions, and I think the Folger Shakespeare Library is another one prime for that. I wanted, though, to get back to a question that was raised for Jim. A part of the strategy about intellectual diversity is that I've recently joined the organization, the Heterodox Academy, which is trying to promote viewpoint diversity in the academy. And I've actually pitched this very talk to them, and I'm scheduled to present it on May 7th. So hopefully, that can also contribute to spreading the word throughout the disciplines about the need for intellectual diversity in Shakespeare studies.
So we have the librarians and the historians on our side today. So excellent. Don Rubin asks, how has your paper been received by librarians and other knowledge workers? Have you had responses?
I have not heard. I've had a good relationship with the editors of the book, but I haven't heard anything from them about how it's been received. It was only published in November, so it's still early days. I haven't read a review of the book yet, but yeah, I will be curious. I will try to get this into library conferences as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your highly informative and philosophically based presentation, Michael. So much appreciate your perspective on this and your quotes of those mean-spirited Shakespeare birthplace trust dragons, wonderful things.